Sometimes destiny arrives not as a grand announcement, but as a wrong turn on a dusty road. Sometimes the person who saves you is the very one you've been unknowingly watching from a distance. And sometimes the most powerful woman in 3 counties finds herself completely powerless against the quiet strength of a man who fixes things not for money, but for hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of a single father whose gentle hands could mend anything except his own broken heart, and the mysterious woman whose ranch became the canvas for both their healing. If you believe that love often wears work boots and shows up when you least expect it, stay with us. The truck's engine coughed like an old man fighting off winter, each wheeze echoing across the empty highway as Marcus Coleman pressed the accelerator with the desperate hope of someone who couldn't afford another breakdown. The dashboard clock blinked a stubborn 7:23 a.m., though the sun had been up for hours, casting long shadows across the rolling hills of Copper Ridge County. In the passenger seat, 8-year-old Tyler dozed fitfully, his small hand clutching a battered teddy bear that had seen better days, much like everything else in their lives these past 2 years. Marcus hadn't planned to take the exit marked Creek Township. The GPS had died somewhere around mile marker 47, and his phone showed no signal bars in this forgotten corner of Montana. He'd been driving for 3 days straight, leaving behind a foreclosed house in Ohio, a job that disappeared with the factory closure, and memories that weighed heavier than all their possessions combined. The only plan he had was to reach his brother's place in Seattle, where maybe, just maybe, they could start over again. But the truck had other ideas. The temperature gauge climbed steadily into the red zone, forcing Marcus to pull off at the first exit he saw. Creek Township turned out to be little more than a gas station, a weathered diner called Rusty's, and a general store that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 1980s. The mechanic at the gas station, a grizzled man named Pete with motor oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, delivered the verdict with the bedside manner of a funeral director. "Radiator's shot," Pete announced, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been white once upon a time. "Water pump's on its last legs, too. You're looking at maybe $800, and that's if I can find the parts. Might take a week, maybe more." Marcus felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd carried since Sarah's funeral, since the medical bills started arriving, since everything solid in his world had crumbled like old concrete. $800 might as well have been $8,000. His wallet held exactly $43 and some loose change, barely enough for gas and food for the next few days. Tyler stirred awake, blinking up at his father with sleepy eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. We broken down again, Dad." Marcus forced a smile, the kind he'd perfected over the past year. "Just a little hiccup, buddy. Nothing we can't handle." Pete's expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. "Tell you what," he said, lowering his voice. "There's a lady about 5 miles up Sunset Road Mike could use some help. Ranch house needs some work, and she's been looking for someone handy. Can't pay much, but it might cover your repair costs and then some. Name's Elena Vasquez. Good people." Marcus considered this. He'd done construction work before the factory job, had always been good with his hands. Sarah used to joke that he could fix anything except her illness. The memory stung, but he pushed it aside. Tyler needed stability, needed a roof over his head that wasn't the cab of a broken-down truck. "What kind of work?" Marcus asked. "Bit of everything. From what I hear, fence repairs, some roofing, general maintenance. Place is big enough that there's probably months of work if you do it right." Pete scratched his stubbled chin. "Elena's a quiet one, keeps to herself mostly. Lives alone in that big house, far as I know. Lost her husband a few years back." Within an hour, Marcus found himself driving slowly up a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever. The landscape here was different from anything he'd seen before. Vast rolling hills covered in golden grass, dotted with clusters of oak trees that stood like sentinels against the endless sky. The road curved and climbed, revealing glimpses of distant mountains purple with morning haze. Tyler pressed his face to the window, his earlier sleepiness forgotten. "Dad, look at all that space. It's like a movie." Marcus had to agree. The sheer scale of the land was breathtaking. Fencing stretched as far as he could see in every direction, marking boundaries that seemed to encompass entire horizons. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, looking like toys from this distance. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a kingdom of grass and sky. As they rounded a final curve, the house came into view, and Marcus had to catch his breath. It wasn't the modest farmhouse he'd expected. This was a structure that commanded respect, 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, with a wraparound porch that could host a small-town gathering. But even from a distance, he could see the signs of neglect. Shutters hung at odd angles, portions of the roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away, and the porch railing sagged in places like an old man's shoulders. The house sat in the center of what must have once been a carefully maintained yard, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees. A barn stood off to one side, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, and several outbuildings dotted the property in various states of disrepair. It was beautiful in a haunting way, like a grand lady who'd fallen on hard times but retained her dignity. Marcus parked near the front porch and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was more than he'd bargained for. The scope of work needed here could keep a full crew busy for months. But desperation had a way of making decisions easier. And he needed this opportunity more than his pride needed protecting. He was reaching for the door handle when Tyler grabbed his arm. "Dad, someone's watching us." Marcus followed his son's gaze to an upstairs window where a curtain had moved slightly. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of a face, a woman with dark hair pulled back, features he couldn't quite make out from this distance. Then the curtain fell back into place, and the window was empty again. "Should we go knock on the door?" Tyler asked, his voice carrying that mix of excitement and nervousness that came with new places and new people. "That's the plan, kiddo." They climbed the porch steps together, Marcus noting how the boards creaked under their weight and several needed replacing entirely. The front door was solid oak, carved with intricate patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. A brass knocker shaped like a horse's head hung in the center, tarnished but still dignified. Marcus knocked 3 times and waited. Footsteps approached from inside, slow and deliberate. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a woman's face, and Marcus felt his breath catch slightly. Elena Vasquez was probably in her early 40s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed high cheekbones and intelligent brown eyes. She wore a simple blue work shirt and jeans, but there was something about her posture, the way she held herself, that suggested she was accustomed to being in charge. "Are you Marcus?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that made his name sound musical. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus Coleman. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is my son, Tyler. Pete at the gas station said you might have some work available." Elena's eyes shifted to Tyler, and her expression softened noticeably. "Hello, Tyler. How old are you?" 8, Tyler replied with the forthrightness that Marcus both admired and worried about. "Our truck's broken, so Dad's looking for work to fix it. He's really good at fixing things." A small smile played at the corners of Elena's mouth. "Is that so?" She looked back at Marcus, and he felt like she was taking his measure in ways that went beyond his carpentry skills. "Pete mentioned you had construction experience." 15 years, Marcus confirmed. Mostly residential, some commercial. I can handle pretty much anything that needs fixing. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Marcus to Tyler and back again. Marcus got the sense she was making some kind of internal calculation, weighing factors he couldn't guess at. The work is extensive, she said finally. This place has been neglected for too long. It would take months to address everything that needs attention. I'm not afraid of hard work, ma'am. The pay isn't much. I can offer room and board in the guest house, plus enough to cover your truck repairs and a little extra. But it's not going to make you rich. Marcus felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. Room and board would be more than enough. We've been living in the truck for the past week. Something shifted in Elena's expression, a flicker of what might have been sympathy or understanding. She opened the door wider, stepping back to let them in. Come in. Let me show you what needs to be done. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. But like the outside, it showed signs of neglect. Paint peeled in places, some floorboards creaked ominously, and Marcus could see water stains on the ceiling that suggested roof problems. Elena led them through room after room, each one spacious and well-proportioned, but bearing the same signs of deferred maintenance. She spoke matter-of-factly about what needed attention: the leaking roof, the sagging porch, windows that wouldn't open, electrical outlets that didn't work. The list was daunting, but Marcus found himself mentally cataloging the work, estimating time and materials, already planning his approach. Tyler wandered beside them, wide-eyed at the sheer size of the place. In one room, he stopped in front of a massive stone fireplace, craning his neck to look up at the mantelpiece. "This house is huge," he announced. "It's like a castle." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her. "It feels too big sometimes, especially when you're the only one living in it." They ended the tour in the kitchen, a large room with farmhouse-style cabinets and a window that looked out over the backyard toward the barn. Elena put on a pot of coffee and offered Tyler a glass of milk and some cookies from a jar that looked like it had been waiting for just such an occasion. "Tell me about yourself," Elena said as they sat around the kitchen table. "Where are you coming from?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share. But there was something about Elena's direct gaze that invited honesty. "Ohio originally. Lost my job when the factory closed, then lost the house. We're headed to Seattle where my brother lives, but..." He gestured vaguely, encompassing their current situation. "I'm sorry for your troubles." Elena's voice was gentle, without pity. "What about Tyler's mother?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Tyler looked up from his cookies, and Marcus saw the familiar shadow cross his son's face. "She passed away 2 years ago," Marcus said quietly. "Cancer." Elena was silent for a long moment, her coffee cup cradled between her hands. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she said finally. "Heart attack. He was only 45. The shared understanding passed between them without need for words. Loss was a language they both spoke fluently, even if they'd learned it through different tragedies. "The guest house is small but comfortable," Elena continued, shifting back to practical matters. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area. It's been empty for a while, but it's clean and furnished. You're welcome to use it, as long as the work lasts." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "That's very generous. When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow, if you're ready. I'll give you a list of priorities, but you can work at your own pace. I'm not in a hurry. I've lived with these problems for 3 years already." As they talked logistics, Marcus found himself studying Elena more closely. There was something almost regal about her bearing, the way she moved with unconscious confidence through the large house. Her hands were soft, not the calloused hands of someone who did manual labor. Yet she spoke knowledgeably about the repairs needed. She seemed comfortable with authority, making decisions quickly and clearly. Tyler had finished his cookies and was exploring the kitchen, running his hands along the smooth granite countertops and peering into cabinets with the curiosity of a child in a new environment. "Can I see my room?" he asked Elena with the directness that made Marcus wince sometimes. "Of course." Elena stood, brushing crumbs from her shirt. "Let's go take a look at your new temporary home." The guest house sat about 100 yards from the main house, connected by a stone pathway that wound through what had once been a garden. Like everything else on the property, it showed signs of neglect, but the structure was sound. Elena produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the front door. The interior was indeed small but charming, with knotty pine walls and windows that looked out toward the mountains. The furniture was simple but comfortable, a couch and coffee table in the living room, a small dining table, and a kitchen equipped with everything they would need. Tyler claimed the smaller bedroom immediately, bouncing on the bed to test its springs and pronouncing it perfect. Marcus took the larger room, noting the clean sheets and the way sunlight streamed through windows that actually opened properly. "There's a washer and dryer in the mudroom," Elena said, "and you're welcome to use the main house's kitchen if you need more space or want to cook something that requires a bigger oven." They spent the next hour unloading their few possessions from the truck, Tyler chattering excitedly about having his own room again, and Marcus trying to process the sudden change in their circumstances. Just that morning, they'd been sleeping in the truck cab, facing an uncertain future with a broken-down vehicle and dwindling resources. Now they had a roof over their heads and the prospect of steady work. As evening approached, Elena invited them to dinner in the main house. She'd prepared a simple meal of grilled chicken, vegetables from what she described as the only successful part of my garden, and fresh bread that filled the kitchen with warmth and the promise of home. Tyler ate with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, while Marcus found himself watching Elena as she moved around the kitchen. She cooked with the efficiency of someone who was used to taking care of herself, but there was something lonely about it too. The way she automatically set only 3 places at a table that could easily seat 8. "Tell me about the ranch," Marcus said over dinner. "How long have you lived here?" Elena paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "My family has owned this land for 4 generations. My great-grandfather started with just a few hundred acres and kept adding to it over the years. My father expanded it even more." She gestured toward the window. "Now it's substantial." "How substantial?" Tyler asked with the bluntness that made Marcus want to apologize for his son's curiosity. Elena smiled. "Substantial enough that I sometimes forget where the boundaries are." She deflected further questions about the ranch's size, steering the conversation instead to Tyler's schooling and Marcus's plans for the repair work. But Marcus caught something in her tone when she talked about the land, a weight that suggested it was more burden than blessing. After dinner, Elena walked them back to the guest house as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of grass and distant wood smoke. "There's one thing I should mention," Elena said as they reached the guest house door. "I value privacy. I don't have visitors often, and I prefer to keep to myself most of the time. I hope you'll understand if I'm not always available for conversation." Marcus nodded, though he wondered at the loneliness behind the words. "Of course, we'll try not to be a bother." "You're not a bother." Elena's voice was soft, almost surprised. "It's been a long time since there were voices in that house besides my own." That night, as Marcus lay in a real bed for the first time in a week, he stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of their sudden change in fortune. Through the thin walls, he could hear Tyler breathing deeply in the next room, the sound of a child finally able to sleep soundly. The work ahead would be extensive, he knew that much. But there was something about this place, about Elena, that felt like more than just a job. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at Tyler, with a gentleness that suggested she understood what it meant to care for something precious and fragile. Maybe it was the way she'd offered them not just work but shelter, not just wages but a home, however temporary. Or maybe it was the mystery of her, the sense that there was much more to Elena Vasquez than met the eye. The ranch was vast beyond anything he'd imagined, yet she lived alone in that huge house. She spoke of the land with both pride and burden, as if she carried the weight of generations on her shoulders. And there was something in her eyes, a sadness that matched his own, the look of someone who'd learned that life could take away everything you thought was permanent. Marcus fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through grass, a sound he'd never heard in the city, but that seemed to speak of endless space and possibility. Tomorrow he would begin the work of restoring Elena's house, but he had the strange feeling that the restoration might go both ways. In the main house, Elena stood at her bedroom window, looking out toward the guest house where warm light glowed in the windows. She couldn't remember the last time the property had felt so alive, so occupied with purpose beyond her own solitary existence. She'd made the offer to Marcus almost impulsively, moved by something in his face when he'd spoken about his son, about the series of losses that had brought them to her door. She recognized the look of someone who was holding everything together. Through sheer will, the way she'd done for the past 3 years since David's death. But it was more than sympathy that had prompted her decision. There was something about Marcus Coleman that intrigued her, the quiet competence in the way he'd assessed the needed repairs, the gentleness with which he treated his son, the absence of the desperate edge that might have made her wary. He seemed like a man who could be trusted with her solitude, who would respect the boundaries she'd built around herself. Elena touched the window glass, feeling its coolness against her palm. She'd grown used to silence, to the empty echo of her footsteps in rooms that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. David had been gone long enough that she'd stopped expecting to hear his voice calling her name, stopped turning when she caught movement in her peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing but shadow. But tonight, with Marcus and Tyler just 100 yards away, the silence felt different. Not oppressive, but expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. She thought about Marcus's hands, calloused and competent, and the way he'd run them along the damaged porch railing as if he could feel the house's pain. She thought about Tyler's bright curiosity, the way he'd looked at the grand staircase as if it were a mountain to be climbed. And she wondered if she'd made a mistake, inviting strangers into her carefully ordered solitude. But the decision was made, and Elena Vasquez was not a woman who second-guessed herself often. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, and she would face it as she'd faced everything else in the past 3 years, with the strength that 4 generations of her family had built into these walls, and the knowledge that sometimes the best things came disguised as the most unexpected. The guest house lights went out one by one, and Elena finally stepped back from the window. In the morning, the work would begin, and with it, perhaps, the slow process of bringing life back to a place that had been holding its breath for far too long. The morning air carried a crisp bite that spoke of changing seasons, and Marcus woke to the sound of roosters crowing somewhere in the distance. For a moment he lay still, letting his mind catch up with his new reality. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar windows, and the mattress beneath him was the most comfortable thing he'd slept on in months. Through the thin walls, he could hear Tyler moving around in the next room, probably exploring every corner of his new temporary home. Marcus dressed quickly in his work clothes and stepped outside to find Tyler already on the small porch, sitting cross-legged with his sketchpad balanced on his knees. The boy had always been an early riser, a trait that had served them well during their days of sleeping in truck stops and parking lots. "What are you drawing, buddy?" Tyler held up his sketchpad, revealing a surprisingly detailed drawing of the main house with its wraparound porch and towering oak trees. I wanted to remember what it looked like on our first morning here, he said seriously. Mom always said drawings help you remember the important stuff. The mention of Sarah hit Marcus like it always did, a quick sharp pain that had dulled over time but never quite disappeared. Tyler talked about his mother more freely now, which the grief counselor had said was healthy, but it still caught Marcus off guard sometimes. That's beautiful, Ty. She would have loved seeing you draw. This place. They made a simple breakfast in the guest house kitchen, and Marcus was surprised by how natural it felt to have a routine again, even a temporary one. Through the window, he could see Elena moving around in the main house, a shadowy figure behind gauze curtains who seemed to drift from room to room like a ghost in her own home. At exactly 8 o'clock, Elena appeared on her back porch with a steaming mug of coffee and a manila folder tucked under her arm. She'd changed from the previous evening's casual clothes into work attire that somehow managed to look both practical and elegant. Her dark hair was braided back, and she wore boots that had seen actual use, not the decorative kind that city people bought to look the part. "Good morning," she called across the yard. "Ready to see what you've gotten yourself into?" Marcus and Tyler walked over to meet her, and Elena handed Marcus the folder. Inside were detailed lists written in neat handwriting, organized by priority and location. The scope of work was even more extensive than he'd realized during yesterday's tour. "I've broken it down by urgency," Elena explained, pointing to the color-coded sections. "Red items are things that could cause damage if we wait much longer. Yellow are important, but not critical. Green are improvements that would be nice but aren't necessary." Marcus scanned the lists, impressed by the thoroughness. Elena had clearly thought about this systematically, identifying not just what needed to be done, but why and in what order. It was the kind of planning that spoke of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. "This is very detailed," he said. "Have you done project management before?" Something flickered across Elena's face, quickly suppressed. "I've had to learn to be organized. When you're managing a property this size alone, you have to stay on top of things or they get away from you fast." She led them to a large outbuilding that served as a workshop and storage area. Inside, Marcus found a treasure trove of tools and materials, many of them high quality and barely used. There were power tools still in their original cases, lumber sorted and stored properly, and hardware organized in labeled bins with the precision of someone who valued efficiency. "David loved tools," Elena said, noticing Marcus's expression. "He was always buying equipment for projects he never quite got around to starting. Most of this has been sitting here unused since he died." Tyler wandered among the shelves, fascinated by the array of gadgets and supplies. "It's like a hardware store," he announced with the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent enough time around construction sites to appreciate quality equipment. "Feel free to use whatever you need," Elena told Marcus. David would have liked knowing his tools were finally being put to good use. They spent the morning doing a more detailed assessment of the house's condition. Marcus carried a notebook and measuring tape, while Tyler appointed himself assistant inspector, pointing out loose boards and asking questions about everything they encountered. Elena stayed nearby but not too close, available for questions but careful not to hover. The roof damage was worse than it had appeared from the ground. Several areas showed signs of water infiltration, and some of the wooden shingles were rotted beyond repair. Marcus made notes about materials they'd need and began calculating how long each section would take to complete properly. "This is going to be a big job," he told Elena honestly as they stood in the master bedroom, looking up at a water stain that covered half the ceiling. "We're talking weeks just for the roof work, assuming we don't find structural damage once we get into it." Elena nodded as if she'd expected this. "I know it's extensive. That's why I've been putting it off for so long. But it needs to be done right, and I'd rather take the time to do it properly than rush and have problems later." "I appreciate that attitude," Too many people want the quick fix that ends up costing more in the long run. As they worked through the assessment, Marcus found himself studying Elena when she wasn't looking. There was something almost contradictory about her. She lived in this massive house on what appeared to be an enormous ranch, yet she drove a modest pickup truck and wore practical clothes without designer labels. She spoke knowledgeably about construction and repairs, yet her hands were soft and showed no signs of manual labor. Most puzzling, she seemed to have unlimited resources for materials and repairs, yet claimed she couldn't pay much for labor. Tyler, meanwhile, had discovered a family of barn cats living in one of the outbuildings. Elena had noticed his fascination and had quietly produced a can of cat food from somewhere, showing him how to approach the skittish animals without frightening them. "They showed up about 6 months ago," she explained as Tyler patiently held out his hand for a tabby kitten to sniff. "I think someone dumped them here, but they've made themselves at home. They're good mousers, so I don't mind the company. Can we help take care of them?" Tyler asked with the hopeful expression that Marcus recognized as his son's way of testing boundaries in new situations. "I'd like that," Elena said, and Marcus caught something wistful in her voice. "It gets lonely out here sometimes. The cats are good company, but they're not much for conversation." By noon, Marcus had a clear picture of what needed to be done and had started prioritizing the work. The roof was definitely the first priority, followed by some foundation issues near the back porch. Then the long list of smaller repairs that would gradually restore the house to its former glory. Elena invited them to lunch in the main house, and Marcus was again struck by the casual elegance of her surroundings. The dining room where they ate could have seated 20 people comfortably, yet she'd set just 3 places at one end of the massive oak table. Crystal glasses and silver flatware suggested wealth, but the simple sandwich lunch and homemade soup spoke of someone who valued substance over show. "Tell me about Tyler's schooling," Elena said as they ate. "Will he be starting at the local school?" Marcus felt the familiar knot in his stomach that came with questions about Tyler's education. "We're kind of between situations right now. He was enrolled in Ohio, but obviously we had to leave that behind. I haven't figured out what to do about school here, since this is supposed to be temporary." Elena was quiet for a moment, cutting her sandwich into precise triangles. "The local elementary school is quite good. Small classes, dedicated teachers. If you'd like, I could make some calls. Tyler could start immediately and transfer his records later." "That would be amazing," Marcus said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I've been worried about him falling behind." "Can I really go to school here?" Tyler asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "Will there be other kids?" "Lots of other kids," Elena assured him. "And I think you'll find that children here are pretty friendly to newcomers. It's a small community. Everyone looks out for each other." After lunch, Marcus began work on the most urgent roof repairs, while Tyler settled at the kitchen table with some books Elena had found for him. Afternoon flew by as Marcus lost himself in the familiar rhythm of construction work. There was something deeply satisfying about taking something broken and making it whole again, about seeing immediate progress from his efforts. Elena appeared periodically, bringing him water or checking on his progress, but she was careful not to interrupt his concentration. Marcus appreciated her understanding that good work required focus, and he found himself working with more care and attention to detail than he might have for a paying customer who was rushing him. Around 4 o'clock, Tyler came outside to watch his father work. Marcus was replacing damaged shingles on a section of roof that overhung the back porch, and Tyler positioned himself where he could see but stay safely out of the way. "Dad, how come Elena lives in such a big house all by herself?" Marcus paused in his hammering. "I don't know, buddy. Sometimes people have big houses for lots of reasons." "She seems sad," Tyler observed with the directness that children brought to emotional observations. "Like the way you were sad after Mom died, but different." "Different how?" Tyler scrunched up his face, thinking. Your sad was like you were. Angry at the sad. Her sad is like she's just tired of being sad, but doesn't know how to stop. Marcus stopped working entirely and looked down at his son. Sometimes Tyler's insights were startling in their accuracy. That's very perceptive. Ty, what makes you think that? The way she looks at things. Like when she showed me the cat food, she looked at the can like it made her remember something that hurt. And when we were in the big room with all the pictures, she kept touching the frame of one picture, but then pulling her hand away real fast. Marcus had noticed the photographs Tyler was talking about. The living room mantelpiece was covered with framed pictures, mostly of Elena with a tall man who had kind eyes and an easy smile. Her late husband, obviously, and the pain in Elena's face when she glanced at them had been unmistakable. She lost someone she loved very much, Marcus said carefully. Just like we lost Mom. People deal with that kind of sadness in different ways. Maybe she needs friends, Tyler suggested with the innocent logic of childhood. Maybe that's why she wanted us to come here. Before Marcus could respond, Elena appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a pitcher of what looked like lemonade and wearing an expression that suggested she might have overheard part of their conversation. I thought you might be thirsty, she said, setting the pitcher on a nearby table. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Marcus caught something vulnerable in her expression. Thank you, Marcus said, climbing down from the ladder. That's very thoughtful. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking the cold lemonade and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard. Tyler entertained himself by trying to coax the barn cats closer, making soft clicking noises and moving very slowly so as not to startle them. He's good with animals, Elena observed. He gets that from his mother. She could charm any creature, wild or domestic. Used to drive me crazy how dogs would abandon me the minute she walked into a room. Elena smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Marcus had seen from her. David was like that too. Animals trusted him instinctively. I think it was because he never tried to force anything. He just let them come to him on their own terms. Sounds like a wise approach to more than just animals. It was. Elena's voice grew quiet. He was patient with everything. With me, especially. I can be difficult sometimes. Too independent. Too used to having my own way. Marcus studied her profile as she watched Tyler with the cats. Independence isn't a character flaw. Especially for someone in your situation. What situation is that? Marcus gestured broadly at the house, the land, the obvious scope of the property. Managing all this alone. It must be overwhelming sometimes. Elena was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if he'd overstepped some boundary. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. People think that having resources makes everything easier. But sometimes it just makes the choices more complicated. When you have the ability to do anything, deciding what you should do becomes much harder. There was something in her tone that suggested deeper waters than Marcus had realized. Before he could pursue the thought, Tyler came running over with excitement written all over his face. Dad, Elena! The orange cat. Let me pet her. She purred and everything. Elena's face brightened at Tyler's enthusiasm. That's Cinnamon. She's usually very shy with strangers. You must have made quite an impression. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together in an easy rhythm. Marcus continued his roof repairs while Alana tackled some garden work that had been neglected. And Tyler divided his attention between helping both of them and continuing his campaign to befriend the barn cats. It felt remarkably natural, like a family working together on weekend projects, and Marcus had to remind himself that this was temporary employment, not a permanent arrangement. As evening approached, Elena disappeared into the house and returned with ingredients for dinner. She set up a small barbecue grill on the back porch and began preparing what looked like enough food for twice as many people. I may have gone overboard, she admitted when Marcus commented on the quantity. "I'm not used to cooking for other people anymore. I tend to default to the amounts I used to make when David was alive." David had a good appetite. David could eat constantly and never gain a pound. I used to joke that he had a hollow leg. Elena's voice carried affection without the sharp edge of pain that Marcus expected. He was one of those people who burned energy just by existing. Always moving. Always working on some project or another. They ate dinner on the back porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Tyler regaled them with detailed descriptions of each cat's personality, having apparently become an expert on feline behavior in the course of a single afternoon. "Cinnamon is definitely the leader," he announced seriously. "The gray one, that's Smokey, does whatever Cinnamon says. And the little black one is the troublemaker. I saw him knock over a whole stack of buckets just to see what would happen." Elena laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did Marcus. "You figured them out faster than I did. It took me weeks to understand their hierarchy." "Animals are easy," Tyler said with the confidence of 8-year-old wisdom. "They tell you exactly what they're thinking if you know how to look." "If only people were that straightforward," Elena murmured, glancing at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. After dinner, they walked around the property as Elena pointed out various features and explained some of the ranch's history. The scale of it continued to amaze Marcus. Fencing stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, and Elena spoke casually of pastures and water rights and seasonal grazing patterns, as if she were discussing a backyard garden. "How many acres are we talking about?" Marcus asked, trying to get some sense of the property's actual size. Elena hesitated, and Marcus caught that flicker of calculation he'd noticed before. "It's substantial," she said finally. "My family has been accumulating land for 4 generations. Sometimes I'm not entirely sure where all the boundaries are anymore." It was an evasive answer, and Marcus filed it away with the other small mysteries he'd noticed about Elena. The expensive tools that had never been used. The casual way she'd offered to pay for Tyler's school enrollment. The house that was far grander than anything most ranchers could afford. And now her vagueness about the size of her property. Either Elena Vasquez was much wealthier than she was letting on, or there was something about her situation that she wasn't comfortable discussing. But as they walked back toward the guest house in the gathering dusk, Tyler running ahead to check on the cats one more time, Marcus found that his curiosity about Elena's secrets was tempered by gratitude for her kindness. Whatever her reasons for being evasive, she'd given them shelter and work when they desperately needed both. He could afford to be patient with her mysteries. "Thank you for today," he said as they reached the guest house door. "For everything. Tyler hasn't been this happy in months." Elena's smile was soft and genuine. "He's a wonderful boy, Marcus. You should be proud. I try to be. Some days are easier than others. Single parenting is the hardest job in the world. I've watched friends struggle with it, and I don't know how they manage to stay sane." There was something wistful in her voice, and Marcus wondered if she and David had planned to have children, if that was another loss she carried along with his death. "Were you and David planning to have kids?" Elena's expression grew distant. "We talked about it, but there was always something else that seemed more urgent. Business responsibilities, travel, projects that needed attention. We kept saying we'd get to it when things settled down." She paused, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Things never settle down, do they? There's always one more reason to wait. I'm sorry." "That must be a hard regret to carry, one of many." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "David always said we had plenty of time. He was wrong about that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood the weight of loss and the brutal education it provided about life's fragility. "Well," Elena said finally, her voice returning to its normal tone, Tomorrow we tackle the real work. Are you ready for it? Absolutely. And Elena, thank you for giving us a chance. I know you don't really know anything about us. Elena studied his face in the dim light from the porch lamp. I know enough. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people. Inside the guest house, Marcus tucked Tyler into bed and listened to his son's excited recap of their first full day at the ranch. Tyler had decided that the barn cats were going to be his special project, and he'd already made plans for building them a proper shelter for the coming winter. Do you think we'll stay here long enough for me to finish the cat house? Tyler asked as Marcus turned off the bedside lamp. I don't know, buddy. It depends on how much work there is and how long it takes me to do it properly. I hope it takes a really long time, Tyler said drowsily. I like it here. I like Elena too. She's sad like you were sad, but she's getting less sad, I think. What makes you think that? She smiled more today than yesterday, and she laughed when I told her about the cats. People who are too sad don't laugh. Marcus kissed his son's forehead and quietly left the room. From his own bedroom window, he could see the main house, most of its windows dark except for one room on the second floor where Elena was probably settling in for the night. Tyler was right about Elena becoming less sad, Marcus realized. There had been moments today when he'd caught glimpses of who she might have been before loss changed her. Moments when her guard came down and revealed someone warm and engaging underneath the careful control. He thought about her evasiveness regarding the ranch's size. Her obvious wealth contrasted with her claims of not being able to pay much for labor, and the way she carried herself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being in charge of significant responsibilities. Elena Vasquez was clearly more than she appeared to be. But Marcus found himself hoping that whatever her secrets were, they wouldn't change the growing sense of connection he felt to this place and to her. In the main house, Elena stood at her bedroom window, looking down at the guest house where warm light glowed behind curtains. She couldn't remember the last time the property had felt so alive, so full of purpose and positive energy. Marcus and Tyler had brought something to the ranch that had been missing since David's death, the sense that it was a home rather than just a house where someone happened to live. She thought about Marcus's questions regarding the ranch's size and her own evasive answers. Soon enough, he'd figure out that the Vasquez ranch wasn't just substantial, it was one of the largest private landholdings in the state. The family empire that 4 generations had built encompassed over 200,000 acres, with mineral rights, water rights, and agricultural leases that generated more income than most small countries. Elena had inherited not just a ranch but a legacy that came with responsibilities she'd never wanted and pressure she'd struggled to handle alone. David had understood the burden of it, had helped her manage the business side while she focused on the land itself. Without him, she'd been drowning in decisions and obligations, which was part of why she'd let the house deteriorate so badly. But today, watching Marcus work with quiet competence and seeing Tyler's joy in simple things like befriending barn cats, Elena had felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years' hope. Not just for the house's restoration, but for her own. Maybe healing could be as simple as allowing the right people into your carefully guarded world. Maybe trust could grow from shared work and quiet conversations, and the gradual understanding that some people could be counted on to stay. Elena pressed her palm against the cool window glass and made a silent promise to herself. She would take this slowly, carefully, allowing whatever was developing between them to unfold naturally. Marcus and Tyler had their own healing to do, their own journey to complete. She wouldn't complicate that with her wealth or her business obligations, or the weight of expectations that came with the Vasquez name. For now it was enough that they were here, that the house would be restored properly, and that she was remembering what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow instead of just enduring it. The rest would reveal itself in time. 3 weeks into their stay at the ranch, Marcus had established a rhythm, that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced since Sarah's death. He woke with the sun, worked through the morning hours. When the light was best, took lunch with Elena and Tyler, then continued repairs until the heat became too oppressive. The work was progressing faster than he'd expected, partly because Elena had given him complete freedom to organize his own schedule, and partly because he found himself taking extra care with every detail. Tyler had indeed started at the local elementary school, and the transition had been smoother than Marcus had dared hope. Elena had made the promised phone calls, and within 2 days Tyler was enrolled and attending classes with the enthusiasm of someone starved for normalcy. He came home each afternoon bursting with stories about his new teacher, Mrs. Henderson, and his classmates who were fascinated by his tales of living in different states. Elena had surprised Marcus by offering to handle Tyler's transportation to and from school. She claimed it was on her way to running errands in town, though Marcus suspected she was going out of her way to help them. Her truck would pull up to the guest house each morning at exactly 7:30, and Tyler would climb in with his backpack and lunch, chattering excitedly about what they might learn that day. The arrangement gave Marcus uninterrupted time to focus on the more complex repairs, and he'd made remarkable progress on the roof work. What he'd initially estimated as a month-long project was looking like it might be completed in 3 weeks, assuming the weather held. But as he worked, Marcus found himself unconsciously slowing down, taking extra time to ensure perfect alignment on each shingle, double-checking measurements that he would normally trust to experience. He wasn't ready to leave yet, though. He couldn't quite articulate why. The guest house had become more of a home than anywhere they'd lived since Ohio, and Tyler was thriving in ways Marcus hadn't seen since before Sarah's illness. But beyond the practical benefits, there was something about Elena herself that kept Marcus looking forward to each day's interactions. She'd begun joining him for morning coffee before Tyler woke up, sitting on the guest house porch with her mug cradled in her hands, talking quietly about the day's plans or simply enjoying the peaceful pre-dawn hours. These conversations had become the part of Marcus's day he most anticipated. Though he was careful not to examine too closely why that might be, Elena remained something of a puzzle. Her knowledge of construction and repair work was impressive for someone who claimed to have no hands-on experience, and her suggestions for approaching various problems often saved Marcus time and effort. She spoke casually about complex business concepts, made references to travel destinations around the world, and occasionally used terminology that suggested education far beyond what most ranchers possessed. Yet she seemed genuinely content with their simple routine of work and quiet conversation. The mystery deepened one morning when a UPS truck arrived with a delivery addressed to Elena. Marcus happened to be working on the front porch railing when the driver approached with a large envelope that required a signature. The driver greeted Elena with obvious familiarity, addressing her not as Elena or Mrs. Vasquez, but as Ms. Lancaster. Elena signed for the package quickly and thanked the driver by name, but Marcus caught the slight tension in her posture, and the way she glanced toward him to see if he'd noticed the name discrepancy. When the truck drove away, she offered no explanation for the different surname, and Marcus didn't ask, though the incident added another layer to his growing list of questions about Elena's background. Tyler, meanwhile, had become completely at home on the ranch. His after-school routine involved checking on the barn cats, helping Marcus with small tasks that wouldn't put him in danger, and following Elena around as she tended to various property maintenance issues. She seemed to enjoy his constant stream of questions and observations, answering his inquiries about ranch life with the patience of someone who genuinely liked children. "Why don't you have cows?" Tyler asked one afternoon as he helped Elena check fence posts in the near pasture. Marcus was working on replacing rotted deck boards within earshot, and he found himself listening to their conversation with amusement. "I do have cows," Elena replied. "They're just not here right now. They're grazing in the summer pastures up in the mountains." "How many cows do you have?" Elena paused in her examination of a loose fence wire. Quite a few. Like 10? Or 100? More than 100. Tyler's eyes widened. 1,000? Elena smiled. That careful expression Marcus had learned meant she was editing her response. Something like that. Marcus looked up from his work, struck by Tyler's line of questioning. 1,000 head of cattle represented a substantial operation, far larger than he'd assumed Elena was running. The financial investment alone for that size herd would be enormous, not to mention the land requirements for adequate grazing. Where? Do you keep them all? Tyler continued with the relentless curiosity of childhood. We have summer pastures about 15 miles north of here, up in the mountain valleys. The cattle spend the warm months there. Then we bring them down to the winter pastures before the snow gets too deep. Can we go see them sometime? Elena glanced toward Marcus, and he caught something almost guilty in her expression. Maybe. It's quite a drive, and the roads up there can be rough. That evening, Marcus found himself studying Elena more carefully during dinner. Her clothes were simple but high quality. Her truck was newer than it first appeared, and the casual way she'd mentioned owning mountain pastures for seasonal cattle grazing suggested resources far beyond what most small ranchers possessed. Added to the mysterious package delivery and her evasive answers about the ranch's size, Marcus was beginning to suspect that Elena Vasquez was either much wealthier than she wanted him to know, or there was something else about her situation that she wasn't comfortable sharing. The realization troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He'd grown to trust Elena, had begun to think of her as someone refreshingly honest and straightforward. If she was hiding something significant about herself, it raised questions about her motives for hiring him and offering them shelter. Was this some kind of charity project for her, a way to feel better about her wealth by helping people less fortunate? The thought stung his pride and made him reconsider the growing attraction he'd been trying to ignore. But watching Elena interact with Tyler over dinner, seeing the genuine warmth in her expression when his son told her about his day at school, Marcus found it hard to believe her kindness was anything other than authentic. Whatever secrets she might be keeping, her care for Tyler seemed completely real. Tyler had fallen asleep on the living room sofa after dinner, exhausted from a day that had included school, cat socializing, and helping Marcus organize tools in the workshop. Elena covered him with a soft throw blanket, moving quietly so as not to wake him. "He's had a busy day," she said softly, settling into the chair across from where Marcus sat watching his son sleep peacefully. "He's happier than I've seen him in a long time. This place has been good for him." "It's been good for me too," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd forgotten what it was like to have children's laughter in the house." Marcus looked at her carefully. "You really wanted children with David, didn't you?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on the chair's upholstery. "We tried for several years. It just never happened. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with either of us, which somehow made it worse. If there had been a medical reason, we could have addressed it or accepted it. But having no explanation made it feel like failure. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was one of those things that David was better at accepting than I was. He said we had each other, and that was enough, that maybe we were meant to influence children in other ways. I wasn't as philosophical about it." Elena's smile was tinged with old sadness. "I wanted the whole domestic picture, the chaos, the noise, the feeling of a house full of life." Marcus understood that longing in ways he couldn't fully express. Tyler could use more positive adult influences in his life. His mother was amazing with him, and I try, but there are things I can't give him that a woman's perspective might provide. Like what? Marcus considered this. Emotional vocabulary, for one thing. Sarah was much better at helping him identify and express his feelings. I tend to default to "you're fine" or "shake it off," which isn't always what he needs. Elena laughed softly. "Men and emotional expression. David was the same way. He meant well, but his solution to most emotional problems was to go build something or fix something physical. Sounds like my approach exactly. Though I have to say, there's something therapeutic about physical work when you're dealing with emotional stress. Is that why you've been taking so much extra time with the repairs here? Elena asked, and Marcus looked up sharply, surprised that she'd noticed. I want to do good work for you. The house deserves to be restored properly. The house appreciates the care, but I suspect there's more to it than that. Elena's voice was gentle, without accusation. You've been working like a man who doesn't want the job to end. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. Elena was more perceptive than he'd given her credit for, and her observation hit closer to the truth than he was comfortable admitting. Tyler's settled here. He likes his school. He's made friends. I don't want to disrupt that unless I have to. And what about you? Are you settled here too? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to address. His growing feelings for Elena were complicated enough without the added mysteries surrounding her background and circumstances. I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given us, he said carefully. This has been exactly what we needed. Elena studied his face, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his diplomatic answer to the truth underneath. Marcus, she said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you the kind of man who runs when things get complicated? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? I mean that I've gotten the impression that you've been hurt before, beyond losing your wife. There's a wariness about you sometimes, like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, surprised by her insight. Sarah's illness lasted 2 years. During that time, I learned that most people have a limited capacity for dealing with other people's problems. Friends disappeared. Family members found excuses not to visit. Co-workers avoided me because my situation made them uncomfortable. By the time she died, Tyler and I were pretty much on our own. That must have been devastating. To lose your wife and discover that the people you thought you could count on weren't really there for you. It was educational. I learned not to depend on anyone but myself. Elena nodded slowly. I understand that lesson. But sometimes the teacher is wrong, and the lesson needs to be unlearned. Before Marcus could respond, Tyler stirred on the sofa, mumbling something in his sleep about cats and mathematics homework. The moment of intense conversation passed, and they both turned their attention to getting Tyler settled properly in his own bed in the guest house. But as Marcus lay awake later that night, Elena's words echoed in his mind. Are you the kind of man who runs when things get complicated? The question forced him to examine his own motivations and fears in ways he'd been avoiding. The truth was that he was developing feelings for Elena that went far beyond gratitude for her help. He looked forward to their morning conversations, found excuses to work on projects that would keep him near the house when she was around, and caught himself thinking about her during the quiet evening hours after Tyler was asleep. But the growing list of mysteries surrounding her background made him cautious about trusting those feelings. If Elena was as wealthy as he was beginning to suspect, what did that mean for any potential relationship between them? He was a man with $43 to his name and a truck that needed $800 worth of repairs. She was someone who casually owned mountain pastures and seemed to have unlimited resources for house renovations. The gap between their circumstances was too wide to bridge, even if she were interested in trying. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Marcus was working on replacing some damaged siding when a black sedan pulled up the drive, moving with the careful precision of someone unfamiliar with rural roads. The car was expensive and pristine, completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. 2 men in business suits got out, consulting a tablet and looking around with the slightly lost expression of city people in an unfamiliar environment. The older of the two, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an authoritative bearing, approached Marcus with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting answers. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone polite but carrying an undertone of impatience. "We're looking for Elena Lancaster. Is this the correct address?" Marcus paused in his work, noting the surname that matched what the UPS driver had used. "You mean Elena Vasquez?" The two men exchanged glances. "Yes, she sometimes uses that name." "Is she available?" Before Marcus could respond, Elena appeared. From around the side of the house, her expression carefully controlled, but her posture tense. She was wearing work clothes and had dirt on her hands from whatever project she'd been tackling. But something about her demeanor changed as she approached. The visitors. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted slightly, and she moved with a bearing that Marcus hadn't seen before. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a coolness that contrasted sharply with the warmth Marcus was accustomed to hearing. "I wasn't expecting you." "Miss Lancaster," the older man replied with a slight bow that seemed both respectful and deferential. "I apologize for the unannounced visit, but there are some urgent matters that require your attention. The board meeting has been moved up, and there are several contracts that need your approval before the deadline tomorrow." Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I thought I made it clear that I was taking a sabbatical from active involvement in company operations." "Yes, ma'am, but these are decisions that require the primary shareholder's signature. Mr. Thornton has been managing day-to-day operations, as you requested. But the Montana land acquisition and the renewable energy partnerships can't move forward without your direct approval." Marcus continued working, trying to appear focused on his tasks while his mind raced to process what he was hearing. Elena wasn't just wealthy, she was apparently the primary shareholder in some kind of company large enough to have a board of directors and complex business dealings involving land acquisitions and energy partnerships. Elena glanced toward Marcus, and he caught the conflict in her expression. She looked like someone who'd been hoping to keep two worlds separate and was now watching them collide. "Give me an hour," she told the men. "I need to clean up and review the documents. Wait in your car or drive into town for coffee. I'll call you when I'm ready." The men nodded respectfully and returned to their sedan, though they looked uncertain about what to do with themselves in the middle of rural Montana. Elena watched them drive back down the road toward town, her shoulders sagging slightly once they were out of sight. "I suppose you heard enough of that to have questions," she said, without looking at Marcus. Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Elena Lancaster instead of Elena Vasquez. Primary shareholder of what sounds like a significant company, land acquisitions and energy partnerships." He paused, studying her face. "Want to tell me what's really going on here?" Elena sank down onto the porch steps, suddenly looking exhausted. "It's complicated. I'm starting to figure that out." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, though he felt a mix of confusion and disappointment that she'd been less than honest with him. "How complicated are we talking about?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with resignation. "Lancaster Holdings is one of the largest private land management and energy development companies in the western United States. My grandfather started it, my father expanded it, and I inherited controlling interest when he died 5 years ago. The Vasquez name is my mother's maiden name, which I started using after David's death when I wanted to step back from the business world." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place with an almost audible snap. "So this ranch is part of a portfolio that includes over 400,000 acres across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, plus renewable energy projects, mineral rights, water rights, and agricultural operations that employ over 2,000 people." The numbers were staggering. Marcus had suspected Elena was wealthy, but this was wealth on a scale he couldn't have imagined. She wasn't just rich, she was one of the most powerful landowners in the American West. 400,000 acres. He repeated slowly. And you've been living here alone, pretending to be a simple rancher who can't afford to pay much for repair work. Elena's face flushed. I wasn't pretending. I was trying to have a normal life for a while, away from board meetings and corporate responsibilities and people who only see me as a source of opportunity or funding. So what am I? Marcus asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Another corporate responsibility? A charity project to make you feel better about your wealth? Elena's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. Is that really what you think of me? I don't know what to think. You've been lying to me for 3 weeks about who you are and what you can afford. How am I supposed to know what's real and what's just you playing at being a regular person? The accusation hung between them, and Marcus immediately regretted the harshness of his words. But the hurt and confusion he felt at her deception had overridden his usual careful control. Elena stood up slowly, her expression hurt but defiant. I need to go deal with these business matters. We can discuss this later when you've had time to process what you've learned. She walked toward the house without looking back, leaving Marcus standing alone with his hammer and his racing thoughts. In the space of 10 minutes, his understanding of Elena and their entire situation had been completely upended. The woman he'd been growing to care about was not just wealthy, but possessed of resources that made their circumstances fundamentally unequal in ways he'd never imagined. Tyler came running around the corner of the house, backpack bouncing as he approached. Dad, Mrs. Henderson says we can bring show and tell presentations next week, and I want to talk about the barn cats. Can you help me make a poster? Marcus looked at his son's excited face and felt the weight of their complicated situation settle fully on his shoulders. Tyler was thriving here, happier than he'd been since his mother's death. But how could Marcus continue to accept Elena's help now that he understood the true scope of her wealth? How could he trust his own feelings for her when everything about their relationship had been built on a foundation of partial truths? Sure, buddy, Marcus said, forcing a smile for Tyler's sake. We'll work on it tonight. But as he watched Tyler run toward the guest house to start his homework, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their time at the ranch was about to come to an abrupt end. Elena's business associates would probably convince her to return to her corporate responsibilities, and he would take Tyler and continue their journey to Seattle, with the truck repairs that she had undoubtedly already paid for without telling him. The thought left him feeling hollow in ways that had nothing to do with their practical circumstances and everything to do with the realization that he'd been falling in love with someone who might not actually exist outside of the carefully constructed persona she'd created for her sabbatical from real life. Inside the main house, Elena sat at her father's old desk, staring at the stack of documents the business associates had brought for her review. The papers represented millions of dollars in transactions and decisions that would affect thousands of employees and hundreds of thousands of acres of land. These were the responsibilities she'd inherited along with her wealth, the obligations that had consumed her life before David's death, and that she'd been hiding from ever since. But for the first time in 3 years, those responsibilities felt less like a burden and more like an interruption. For 3 weeks, she'd been Elena Vasquez, a simple rancher who enjoyed morning coffee conversations and children's laughter and the satisfaction of watching skilled hands restore something broken to wholeness. She'd been a woman who could be appreciated for her kindness and intelligence rather than her bank account and business connections. Now Marcus knew the truth, and she'd seen the hurt and suspicion in his eyes when he realized she'd been keeping such significant secrets from him. She couldn't blame him for feeling deceived. She had been deceiving him, even if her motives had been to protect rather than to harm. The question now was whether there was any way to salvage what had been growing between them, or whether the revelation of her true circumstances had destroyed any possibility of a genuine relationship. Elena had learned long ago that her wealth changed how people saw her, but she'd hoped that Marcus might be different, that he might be able to see past the money to the woman underneath. Looking out the window toward where Marcus was working, with renewed intensity on the siding repairs, Elena realized she was about to find out whether her hope had been misplaced or whether love could indeed bridge the gap between their two very different worlds. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife when Elena emerged from the house 2 hours later, dressed in clothes Marcus had never seen before. Gone were the worn jeans and simple work shirts, replaced by a tailored navy blazer. Crisp white blouse and slacks that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month at his old factory job. Her hair was pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, and she wore the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. She looked every inch the corporate executive she apparently was, and the transformation was so complete that Marcus felt like he was looking at a stranger. This poised, authoritative woman bore little resemblance to the Elena who had shared morning coffee with him on the guest house porch, talking quietly about her hopes for restoring the garden or her plans for winterizing the barn cats. The black sedan had returned and was waiting in the circular drive, its occupants presumably ready to whisk Elena away to whatever boardroom crisis required her immediate attention. Marcus continued working on the siding, but his movements were mechanical, his mind churning with emotions he wasn't sure how to process. Elena approached him slowly, her heels clicking on the stone pathway in a rhythm that seemed to emphasize the distance that had suddenly opened between them. When she stopped a few feet away, Marcus could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle that he'd never noticed before, because she'd never worn any during their time together. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the formal politeness of someone addressing a contractor rather than the warmth he'd grown accustomed to. "I need to go to Denver for a few days to handle these business matters. There are some decisions that can't be delayed any longer." Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face her, struck again by how different she looked. "Of course. You have responsibilities. While I'm gone, please continue with the repairs as you see fit. All the materials and tools you need are available. And if you require anything else, just call the number I'll leave for you." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I've arranged for Mrs. Patterson from town to pick up Tyler after school and bring him home. She has grandchildren his age and was happy to help. That's thoughtful of you." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, though he felt a stab of hurt that she'd made arrangements for Tyler's care without consulting him first. Elena shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the awkwardness between them. "Marcus, about what you learned today, you don't owe me any explanations," Marcus interrupted, though he immediately regretted the cold tone in his voice. "You're entitled to your privacy. I'm not sure you understand." "I understand perfectly." Marcus picked up his hammer again, gripping it tighter than necessary. "You're Elena Lancaster, not Elena Vasquez. You own half the western United States instead of just a small ranch. You've been conducting some kind of social experiment, and now you need to get back to your real life." Elena's face flushed with anger. "That's not what this was, and you know it. Do I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a wealthy woman decided to play at being normal for a while, and we just happened to show up at the right time to provide some authentic local color for your experience." The words came out harsher than Marcus had intended, fueled by hurt and confusion and the growing realization that the future he'd been unconsciously building in his mind was nothing more than fantasy. Elena Lancaster didn't need a broken-down construction worker with a beat-up truck and $43 in his wallet. She needed someone from her own world, someone who could navigate board meetings and energy partnerships and the kind of responsibilities that came with managing a business empire. Elena stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through anger, hurt, and finally something that might have been resignation. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, I suppose that makes things simpler." She turned and walked toward the waiting sedan without another word, her posture rigid with controlled emotion. Marcus watched her go, fighting the urge to call after her, to apologize for his cruelty, to ask her to explain what any of this meant for them. But pride and hurt kept him silent, and within minutes the sedan was disappearing down the long drive, taking Elena away from the ranch and back to whatever corporate world she'd temporarily escaped. Tyler came running up from the barn, where he'd been conducting his after-school cat census, completely oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. "Dad, where's Elena going all dressed up like that?" "Business trip," Marcus said, forcing his voice to sound normal. "She'll be back in a few days." "Oh." Tyler looked disappointed but not particularly concerned. At 8 years old, adult comings and goings were still largely mysterious to him, and as long as his immediate world remained stable, he could adapt to changes with the resilience of childhood. That evening, Marcus cooked dinner in the guest house kitchen while Tyler worked on his cat presentation at the small dining table. The silence felt oppressive after weeks of shared meals and easy conversation in the main house, and Marcus found himself listening for Alana's voice or footsteps with an intensity that only emphasized her absence. "Dad, is Alana coming back?" Tyler asked suddenly, looking up from his poster board covered with cat drawings and carefully printed facts about feline behavior. "She said she'd be back in a few days. But is she really coming back, like, to stay?" The question hit closer to home than Tyler probably realized. "I don't know, buddy. She has important work to do that might take her away from the ranch." Tyler considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I hope she comes back. I like her. And I think she likes us too." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "What makes you think that?" "The way she smiles when we're around. Like when Cinnamon first let me pet her, she was happy but also kind of surprised. Like she didn't expect good things to happen but was glad when they did." Out of the mouths of babes. Tyler's observation captured something about Elena that Marcus had noticed but hadn't been able to articulate. There had been a quality of wonder in her interactions with them, as if their presence in her life was a gift she hadn't expected to receive. But that was before he'd learned who she really was. Now Marcus wasn't sure what to believe about Elena's motivations or feelings. Had her warmth been genuine, or just the condescending kindness of someone secure in her superior position? Was her interest in their lives real, or just the curiosity of someone observing an interesting specimen from a different social class? The questions tormented him through a sleepless night and continued to plague him over the following days as he worked alone on the house repairs. Mrs. Patterson proved to be exactly what Elena had promised, a kindly grandmother type who collected Tyler each afternoon and returned him fed and happy after hours of play with her own grandchildren. She asked no questions about the arrangement and seemed to assume that Marcus and Elena had worked out whatever logistics were necessary. Marcus threw himself into the repair work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, attacking each project as if proper restoration of Elena's house could somehow restore the equilibrium in his own life. He replaced every damaged shingle, reinforced every weakened beam, and repaired every minor flaw with a perfectionism that went far beyond the job requirements. But the work that had once felt purposeful and satisfying now felt hollow. Without Elena's occasional visits to check on his progress, without her suggestions for approaching difficult problems, without the comfortable rhythm of shared meals and evening conversations, the repairs felt like exactly what they were, a job that would eventually end, leaving him and Tyler to continue their interrupted journey to Seattle. On the third day of Elena's absence, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was working on replacing the damaged deck boards when a pickup truck pulled up the drive, driven by a man Marcus didn't recognize. The driver was probably in his 60s, with weathered features and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. He wore the kind of clothes that working ranchers actually wore: faded jeans, worn boots, and a shirt that had seen many washings. "You must be Marcus," the man said, climbing out of his truck with the careful movements of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of hard use. "I'm Jack Morrison, Elena's ranch foreman. Well, one of them, anyway." Marcus set down his tools and approached to shake hands. "I didn't realize Elena had a foreman." Jack's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "She's got several, scattered across different properties. I handle the operations here in Montana, the cattle, the seasonal moves, the infrastructure maintenance. Been working for the family for almost 30 years now." This was news to Marcus. In all their conversations, Elena had never mentioned having employees managing the ranch operations. He'd assumed she was handling everything herself, which had been one of the things that impressed him about her apparent competence. "Elena asked me to stop by and check on how you're getting along," Jack continued. "She's been worried about leaving you and your boy on your own while she deals with the corporate nonsense." "We're managing fine," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure why Elena would be worried about their ability to take care of themselves for a few days. Jack nodded, studying Marcus with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. "She also asked me to explain some things that she figures you might not understand about her situation." Marcus felt his defenses rise. "She doesn't owe me any explanations. Maybe not, but she seems to think she does." Jack leaned against his truck, settling in for what was apparently going to be a longer conversation. "You know about the business empire, right? Lancaster Holdings and all that." "I know enough. Do you know how she got it?" Marcus hadn't really considered this question. "She inherited it when her father died, from what she told me." Jack's expression grew serious. "That's true, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Elena's father was, let's say he was better at making money than he was at being a father. He was obsessed with building the business, expanding the holdings, accumulating more and more wealth and power. Elena grew up in that world, groomed from childhood to take over the empire. Sounds like a privileged life." "Privileged, maybe, but not happy." Her father saw her as an extension of himself, not as an individual person with her own desires and dreams. She went to the schools he chose, studied the subjects he demanded, worked in the business from the time she was a teenager. She never had a choice about whether she wanted that life, it was simply expected. Marcus found himself listening more intently, despite his resistance to feeling sympathy for Elena's supposedly difficult, wealthy childhood. When she met David, it was the first time she'd ever defied her father about anything important. David wasn't from their social circle, wasn't wealthy, wasn't the kind of man her father thought was suitable for the Lancaster heir. But Elena loved him, and for once in her life, she chose what she wanted instead of what was expected. Jack paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Her father eventually accepted David, but only because David proved he could be useful to the business. David was smart, had good instincts for the energy sector, and he helped Elena manage the transition when her father's health started failing. But David's death left Elena completely alone with responsibilities she'd never wanted in the first place. So she decided to take a sabbatical. She decided to try to find out who she was when she wasn't being Elena Lancaster, corporate heiress. She wanted to know if anyone could care about her for herself, not for what she could do for them or what access she could provide to wealth and power. The words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He thought about Elena's careful editing of her responses when Tyler asked about the ranch's size, her evasiveness about her resources, her obvious pleasure in simple domestic tasks, like cooking dinner or tending the garden. Had she really been trying to discover whether someone could love her for who she was rather than what she owned? "She found that answer with you and your boy," Jack continued quietly. For the first time in her adult life, Elena was just herself. No corporate responsibilities, no public image to maintain, no one trying to get something from her. Just a woman who enjoyed fixing up an old house and taking care of some stray cats and watching a little boy discover the joy of rural life. Marcus felt shame wash over him as he remembered his angry words about social experiments and authentic local color. I accused her of playing at being normal. Were you wrong? Marcus considered this. During their weeks together, Elena's kindness had never felt calculated or condescending. Her interest in Tyler's school experiences had been genuine. Her enjoyment of their quiet conversations had been real, and her care for the barn cats had been the unthinking compassion of someone who naturally nurtured whatever needed nurturing. Maybe I was wrong, Marcus admitted reluctantly. Jack nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. Elena's been running from those corporate responsibilities for 3 years now, ever since David died. The board and the lawyers and the business managers have been pressuring her to take a more active role, but she's resisted because that world killed everything else good in her life. Her father, her relationship with David to some extent, her own sense of who she was as a person. But now they've tracked her down. They track her down regularly. This time is different because there are some major deals pending that legally require her signature as the primary shareholder. She can't avoid them any longer, but she's terrified that going back to that world will mean losing the life she's built here. Marcus looked toward the main house, thinking about Elena's reluctant transformation from ranch woman to corporate executive. What kind of deals are we talking about? Renewable energy partnerships, sustainable land management initiatives, conservation easements. Actually, they're the kind of projects that align with Elena's personal values, but they're worth hundreds of millions of dollars and involve complex negotiations with government agencies and environmental groups. She can't delegate those decisions to subordinates. The scope of Elena's responsibilities was staggering, and Marcus began to understand why she'd been so reluctant to return to them. The weight of making decisions that would affect thousands of jobs and millions of acres of land would be crushing for anyone, but especially for someone who'd never wanted that level of responsibility in the first place. Jack, Marcus said slowly, why are you telling me all this? The older man smiled, and for the first time, his expression was completely open and friendly. Because Elena's happier than I've seen her since David died, and I'm hoping you won't let pride or misunderstanding ruin that for her, or for yourself. It's more complicated than that. We're from completely different worlds. Are you? From where I sit, you're both people who've lost the person you loved most, both trying to build something meaningful from the pieces that are left. You're both good with your hands, both care about doing quality work, both love that little boy of yours enough to put his needs ahead of your own comfort. Seems like you have more in common than you have differences. Marcus wanted to argue, to point out the obvious obstacles that wealth and social position would create for any relationship between them. But Jack's words resonated with something he'd felt during those morning coffee conversations with Elena, the sense that despite their different backgrounds, they understood each other in fundamental ways. She'll be back tomorrow, Jack said, climbing back into his truck. The Denver meetings are finished, and she's resolved the immediate crises. Question is, will you still be here when she arrives? That evening, Marcus sat on the guest house porch after Tyler had gone to bed, staring up at the star-filled Montana sky and trying to sort through his conflicted feelings. Jack's visit had given him a completely different perspective on Elena's deception, but it had also raised new questions about what kind of future they could possibly have together. Even if Elena's feelings for him were genuine, even if she truly preferred the simple life she'd been living at the ranch, the reality was that she had responsibilities that would always take precedence over personal desires. She owned a business empire that employed thousands of people and managed hundreds of thousands of acres of land. Those obligations wouldn't simply disappear because she'd fallen in love with a construction worker. And Marcus wasn't naive about the challenges that wealth created in relationships. He'd seen enough movies and read enough news stories to know that vast differences in economic status usually created insurmountable problems between couples. How could he ever feel like an equal partner when Elena could buy and sell him 1,000 times over? How could he contribute meaningfully to a relationship when she had resources he couldn't even comprehend? But then he thought about Tyler's observation that Elena smiled differently when they were around, like someone who was surprised by joy but grateful for it. He remembered the genuine pleasure in her voice when she'd told him about the progress on the cat socialization project. The way she'd listened to Tyler's endless questions with the patience of someone who truly enjoyed his curiosity. The careful way she'd maintained boundaries while still making them feel welcome in her space. Those moments hadn't felt like charity or condescension. They'd felt like the beginning of something real and valuable, the foundation of a relationship built on mutual respect and growing affection, rather than economic calculation or social advantage. Marcus was still wrestling with these thoughts when Tyler appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and clutching his teddy bear. "Dad, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about Elena being gone." Marcus opened his arms, and Tyler climbed onto his lap, settling against his chest with the trusting weight of childhood. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm worried she won't come back. Not because she doesn't want to, but because her important work will keep her away forever. Would that make you sad?" Tyler nodded against Marcus's chest. "I like it here. I like my school and my friends and Mrs. Patterson's grandkids. But mostly I like Elena. She makes everything feel more like home." Marcus's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "When it was just you and me, it was good. But it was also kind of lonely sometimes, like we were missing a piece. Elena doesn't feel like a stranger anymore. She feels like family. Like maybe she could be my mom if you wanted her to be." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, partly because of their innocent directness, and partly because they articulated something he'd been afraid to admit to himself. Over the past few weeks, he had begun to think of Elena as more than just their employer, or even a potential romantic interest. She'd started to feel like the missing piece Tyler had identified, the person who could help them build something stable and lasting, instead of just surviving from one crisis to the next. "Buddy, Elena has a very complicated life. She has responsibilities that we don't understand, and she might not be able to stay here permanently. But she wants to, doesn't she? I can tell she's happy here, the same way you're happy here. Can't important work wait sometimes when something more important comes along?" Tyler's question hung in the night air, and Marcus found himself wondering if an 8-year-old might have a clearer perspective on life's priorities than the adults who'd convinced themselves that obligations always trump desires. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of a familiar truck engine in the driveway. Through his bedroom window, he could see Elena's pickup parked in its usual spot, and his heart did something complicated that was part relief, part anticipation, and part terror. She was back, but nothing about their situation had been resolved. If anything, his conversation with Jack had made the complexities of their relationship even clearer. Elena Lancaster might want to be Elena Vasquez, simple rancher. But the obligations that came with her wealth and power wouldn't simply disappear because she preferred a different life. Marcus dressed quickly and stepped outside, unsure whether Elena would want to talk to him, or whether she'd prefer to maintain the formal distance that had characterized their last conversation. He found her in the barn, sitting cross-legged on a bale of hay while Cinnamon purred contentedly in her lap. She'd changed back into her work clothes, but there was something different about her posture, a weariness that hadn't been there before her trip to Denver. "You're back," Marcus said unnecessarily, standing awkwardly in the barn doorway. Elena looked up, and he caught something vulnerable in her expression before she schooled her features into careful neutrality. "I told you I'd be back in a few days. How did the meetings go?" "As well as meetings about hundreds of millions of dollars in business deals can go, I suppose. Everything's been signed and approved and delegated to the appropriate subordinates." Her voice carried a flatness that suggested the corporate world had drained something essential from her. The renewable energy partnerships are moving forward. The conservation easements are in place. And Lancaster Holdings continues its march toward greater profits and expanded influence. Marcus heard the bitterness in her tone and realized that Elena's return to her corporate responsibilities had been every bit as difficult as Jack had suggested it would be. "You don't sound happy about the success." Elena continued stroking Cinnamon's fur, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "Success is a relative term. The business is thriving, the shareholders are satisfied, and we're implementing some genuinely beneficial environmental initiatives. But none of that changes the fact that I'm fundamentally unsuited for the life I've inherited." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I spent 3 days in conference rooms, making decisions about land I've never seen, negotiating with people who view natural resources as profit centers, and signing contracts that will affect communities I've never visited. That's not stewardship, it's just wealth management on a massive scale." Marcus stepped into the barn, drawn by the pain in Elena's voice. "But if you're using that wealth to support conservation and renewable energy, am I? Or am I just making myself feel better about profiting from land speculation and resource extraction by attaching environmental labels to fundamentally exploitative practices?" Elena finally looked up, and Marcus saw exhaustion and confusion in her expression. "The truth is, I don't know how to be Elena Lancaster without becoming someone I don't recognize or respect." The admission hung between them, and Marcus felt his anger and hurt from their last conversation begin to dissolve in the face of Elena's obvious struggle. Whatever deceptions she'd practiced, they hadn't been motivated by callousness or manipulation, but by a desperate desire to escape from responsibilities that were crushing her spirit. "Elena," Marcus said gently, "Jack Morrison came by while you were gone." Elena's head snapped up, alarm flickering across her features. "What did he tell you?" "Enough to help me understand that I was wrong about some things. About why you didn't tell me who you really were, about what your wealth means to you, about what you've been trying to find here." Elena set Cinnamon gently aside and stood, brushing hay from her jeans with movements that seemed designed to buy her time to compose herself. "Jack tends to be more optimistic about people's capacity for understanding complex situations than experience has taught me to be. Try me." Elena studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether he could be trusted with the truth she'd been guarding so carefully. Finally, she sighed and leaned against the barn wall, looking suddenly fragile despite her composure. "I've been wealthy my entire life, Marcus, but I've never been happy. Not until these past few weeks. For the first time since David died, I've felt like myself instead of like someone performing a role she never auditioned for. You and Tyler have given me something I didn't know I was missing. The experience of being valued for who I am rather than what I can provide." Marcus felt his heart clench at the loneliness in her words. "Is that really what you think? That people only value for your money?" "It's what I know. I've had a lifetime to observe how people's behavior changes when they learn about my financial status. Suddenly, every conversation becomes a negotiation. Every friendship becomes a potential business opportunity. Every romantic interest becomes suspect." Elena's voice grew quiet. "David was the only person who ever saw past the money to the woman underneath, and after he died, I didn't think I'd ever find that again. But you found it with us. I thought I had. Until you learned the truth and immediately assumed the worst about my motives." Elena's words were stated as fact rather than accusation, but they still stung. Marcus felt shame wash over him again. "I was wrong. I was hurt and confused, and I said things I didn't mean." "Did you?" "Because everything you said about social experiments and playing at being normal, those are exactly the kinds of assumptions people make about wealthy individuals who try to step outside their prescribed roles." "I was scared," Marcus admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I was falling for you, and when I learned who you really were, I realized that any relationship between us would be impossible." So I lashed out to protect myself from getting hurt. Elena's expression softened slightly. Falling for me? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would determine the future of whatever was developing between them. I know it's complicated. I know our circumstances make it unrealistic. But yes, I was falling for you. For the woman who brought us coffee and took care of the barn cats and listened to Tyler's endless questions, like they were the most important things in the world. That woman is still me, Marcus. The money doesn't change who I am inside, doesn't it? Because you just spent 3 days making decisions about hundreds of millions of dollars. You employ thousands of people and own hundreds of thousands of acres of land. Those responsibilities will always come first, and there's no room in that world for someone like me. Elena pushed away from the barn wall and stepped closer to him, her eyes intense. What if I told you that I've been thinking about walking away from it all? About selling my shares in Lancaster Holdings and using the proceeds to purchase this ranch and a few smaller properties that I could manage personally? What if I told you that these past few weeks have shown me what I really want from life? And it has nothing to do with corporate empires or business deals. Marcus stared at her, stunned by the magnitude of what she was suggesting. You'd give up billions of dollars to be a small rancher? I'd trade billions of dollars that I never wanted for a life that actually belongs to me. There's a difference. Elena, you can't make that kind of decision based on 3 weeks with a man you barely know. Can't I? David and I were together for 8 years, and I never felt as at peace with him as I have with you in 3 weeks. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants faster than the mind is comfortable accepting. Marcus felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of Elena's fierce honesty. What about your responsibilities to the people who work for Lancaster Holdings? What about the conservation projects and renewable energy initiatives? Those projects will continue with or without my direct involvement. The company has excellent management, and my stepping back would probably benefit everyone involved. I've been holding on to control out of obligation and fear, not because my continued involvement is actually necessary. And you'd be content living as a small rancher? Really? Elena smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he'd seen since her return. Marcus, I've never been as content as I was these past few weeks, working alongside you to restore this house, watching Tyler fall in love with the cats, feeling like part of a family instead of the head of a corporation. If that's not worth more than all the money in the world, then I don't understand the purpose of wealth at all. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the fears and assumptions that had been holding him back from fully embracing his feelings for Elena. If she was willing to give up her corporate empire for a chance at a simple life together, then maybe Jack Morrison had been right about wealth not being the barrier Marcus had assumed it was. There's something else, Elena said, her voice growing softer. Tyler asked me before I left for Denver if I was going to be his new mom. I didn't know how to answer him then, but I know how I'd answer now if he asked again. Marcus's heart stopped. What would you say? I'd say that if his father would have me, I'd be honored to be part of your family in whatever way feels right to all of us. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and promise. Marcus looked at Elena's face, seeing past the careful composure to the hope and vulnerability underneath, and realized that all his fears about their different backgrounds paled in comparison to the simple truth that he loved her and she loved him back. Elena, he said quietly, I need you to be sure about this. Because if we do this, if we try to build something together, I need to know that you won't regret giving up your other life. The only thing I'd regret is letting fear stop me from choosing happiness when it's finally within reach. Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. I'm not asking you to join my world, Marcus. I'm asking if I can join yours. Marcus reached for her hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit in his calloused palms. Our world. If we're going to do this, it's our world." Elena smiled, and Marcus saw in her expression the same wonder that Tyler had identified: surprise at unexpected joy, gratitude for the gift of love when she'd stopped believing it was possible. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we figure out how to build a life together. One board at a time, one day at a time, one decision at a time." Elena squeezed his hands. "Starting with whether you're going to kiss me or if I need to take the initiative myself." Marcus laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I think I can handle that responsibility." As he leaned down to kiss the woman who'd given up an empire for the chance to build something real with him, Marcus heard Tyler's voice calling from the house, probably looking for them both. Soon enough, they'd have to explain to an 8-year-old how his show-and-tell presentation about barn cats had accidentally led to the creation of a new family. But for now, in the quiet privacy of the barn where it had all started with Elena's simple kindness to stray animals, Marcus allowed himself to believe that sometimes the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or inherited. They could only be built with love, patience, and the courage to choose happiness over security. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the completed wraparound porch of what was now officially their home, watching Tyler chase the barn cats through the morning sunshine while Elena tended to her expanded garden. The house looked like something from a magazine spread, every board and shingle restored to perfection, but it was the life they'd built inside those walls that truly made it beautiful. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Elena's decision to step back from Lancaster Holdings had required months of careful legal maneuvering, board negotiations, and the gradual transfer of operational control to a management team she trusted. She'd retained a small percentage of ownership to maintain some influence over the company's environmental initiatives, but the day-to-day corporate responsibilities that had consumed her life were now handled by others. With the proceeds from her stock sale, Elena had purchased the ranch outright, along with several adjacent properties, creating a self-contained operation that she could manage personally. She'd also established a trust fund that would ensure Tyler's education and their family's security while deliberately limiting their wealth to amounts that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. Marcus had initially struggled with accepting Elena's financial contributions to their new life together, his pride bristling at the idea of being supported by his partner's money. But Elena had patiently helped him understand that true partnership meant sharing resources as well as responsibilities, and that his skills and knowledge were just as valuable as her capital in building their future together. They'd married in a simple ceremony on the ranch, with Tyler serving as ring bearer and the barn cats providing entertainment for the small gathering of friends and neighbors who'd become their chosen family. Elena had worn her mother's dress, Marcus had worn his only suit, and Tyler had insisted on including the cats in the family photograph that now hung above the restored fireplace mantel. The work of managing the ranch together had created a rhythm that suited them both. Marcus handled the physical maintenance and improvement projects that seemed to multiply endlessly on a property this size, while Elena managed the business side of their cattle operation and the relationships with neighboring ranchers. Tyler had become their unofficial ambassador to the local wildlife, maintaining detailed records of bird migrations, tracking the progress of various animal families, and serving as the ranch's chief cat whisperer. Elena had discovered a talent for the kind of hands-on ranch management that her corporate responsibilities had never allowed her to explore. She could read weather patterns, anticipate market fluctuations, and negotiate grazing agreements with the skill of someone born to the life rather than someone who'd escaped to it from boardrooms and business meetings. But it was the quiet moments that convinced Marcus they'd made the right choices. Elena humming while she cooked breakfast, Tyler reading aloud to the cats from his collection of adventure books, the three of them working together to repair a section of fence damaged by summer storms. These were the scenes that filled the photo albums Elena had started keeping, the memories she treasured more than any corporate achievement from her previous life. The guest house had been converted into Marcus's workshop, where he'd begun taking on custom carpentry projects for neighbors and even some clients from as far away as Denver who'd heard about his meticulous craftsmanship. The work provided enough income to contribute meaningfully to their household expenses, while allowing him to maintain the independence that was important to his sense of self-worth. Tyler had thrived in ways that exceeded even Marcus's most optimistic hopes. His school performance had improved dramatically once his living situation stabilized, and he'd developed friendships with children whose families had become part of their extended community. But most importantly, he'd gained the confidence that came from feeling completely secure in his family's love and commitment to each other. "Dad, look!" Tyler called from across the yard, where he was attempting to teach Cinnamon to walk on a leash. "She's actually doing it." Marcus laughed, watching his son's patient persistence with an animal that clearly had no interest in being walked like a dog. "That's great, buddy. Just remember that cats have their own opinions about most things." Elena emerged from the garden with a basket of fresh vegetables, her hair tied back with a bandana that had belonged to Marcus's mother, and her hands dirty from a morning spent among the tomato plants. She'd never looked more beautiful to him than she did in these moments, when she was completely herself without any pretense or performance. "How's the harvest looking?" Marcus asked, pulling her close for a kiss that tasted like sunshine and possibility. "Better than I expected for my first serious attempt at vegetable gardening. Mrs. Patterson's advice about companion planting was exactly what I needed." Elena leaned into his embrace, solid and warm and perfectly present. "I never imagined I could find this much satisfaction in something as simple as growing food. Different kind of growth than what you were used to managing. Much more rewarding. These tomatoes don't require board meetings or legal negotiations. They just need water, sunlight, and patience." They stood together watching Tyler's ongoing cat training session, comfortable in the kind of silence that only came from deep contentment. The morning was perfect, clear sky, gentle breeze, the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures. But Marcus knew the real perfection lay in the ordinary magic of their daily life together. "I got a call from Jack this morning," Elena said, mentioning the ranch foreman who'd become one of their closest friends and advisors. "The winter pasture rotation is ahead of schedule, and he thinks we might be able to increase the herd size next spring if the market conditions remain favorable. Are you interested in expanding?" Elena considered this, the same careful thought she brought to all their business decisions. "Only if we can do it without compromising our quality of life. I never want us to become so focused on growth that we lose sight of why we're doing this." It was exactly the kind of perspective that had convinced Marcus they could build something sustainable together. Elena approached their ranch operation with the same values that guided their family life, emphasizing quality over quantity, sustainability over short-term profit, and always prioritizing their relationships with each other and their community. Tyler came running over, having apparently given up on cat leash training in favor of more pressing concerns. "Elena, can we start planning my birthday party? I want to have it here on the ranch, and I want to invite everyone from school, and I want to have a barbecue, and maybe we could set up games in the barn." Elena smiled at Tyler's enthusiasm, ruffling his hair with the easy affection that had developed between them over the months. "That sounds like a wonderful plan. When did you want to have this celebration?" "My birthday's not for 3 weeks, but planning is important. That's what you always say about ranch stuff." Marcus caught Elena's eye over Tyler's head, both of them amused by their son's application of ranch management principles to party planning. Tyler had absorbed more of their conversations about business strategy than either of them had realized. "You're absolutely right about planning being important," Elena agreed seriously. "Why don't we sit down after lunch and make a list of everything we'll need to organize?" Tyler beamed at being treated as a capable planning partner rather than just a child with ideas. It was one of the things Marcus most appreciated about Elena's approach to parenting. She respected Tyler's intelligence while still maintaining appropriate boundaries and guidance. The afternoon brought a steady stream of the small tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. Marcus repaired a gate latch that had been sticking. Elena updated their financial records and placed orders for winter feed supplements. And Tyler conducted his weekly inventory of cat personalities and preferences. Each task was small in itself, but together they created the foundation of the life they were building. As evening approached, they gathered on the porch for their daily ritual of watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Elena had started this tradition during their first week as a married family, claiming that taking time to appreciate the beauty around them was just as important as any of their work responsibilities. "I have some news," Elena said as they settled into the wooden chairs Marcus had built for the porch. "I got a call from the conservation group today about the wetland restoration project." Marcus looked up with interest. One of Elena's first initiatives after stepping back from Lancaster Holdings had been to partner with environmental organizations on habitat restoration projects throughout their region. It was her way of using her resources and knowledge to make a positive impact without the complications of corporate bureaucracy. They've secured the additional funding they needed, and they want to expand the project to include the creek bed that runs through our eastern pasture. It would mean setting aside about 50 acres permanently, but they're offering compensation that would more than cover the lost grazing capacity. What do you think? Elena smiled, the expression carrying both satisfaction and a hint of mischief. "I think it's exactly the kind of project that makes owning land feel like stewardship instead of just possession. And Tyler would love having a restored wetland to explore and study." Tyler's eyes lit up at the mention of his name. "Would there be new birds? And maybe frogs and salamanders?" "Almost certainly." The biologist I spoke with said restored wetlands typically attract dozens of species within the first few years. Marcus watched his wife and son discuss the ecological possibilities with shared excitement, marveling at how naturally Elena had adapted to a life where conservation and education were priorities rather than obstacles to profit maximization. She'd found ways to be the person she'd always wanted to be instead of the person her inheritance had demanded she become. "There's something else," Elena continued, her voice taking on the carefully casual tone she used when she was about to share news she wasn't sure how they'd receive. "I've been asked to serve on the advisory board for the state's new Sustainable Agriculture Initiative." Marcus studied her expression, recognizing the signs that Elena was both intrigued by the opportunity and concerned about taking on obligations that might interfere with their family life. "What would that involve?" "Quarterly meetings, reviewing grant applications, providing input on policy recommendations. They specifically want someone with my background who's also actively engaged in small-scale ranching." Elena paused, clearly weighing her words. It would be a way to stay involved in important work without returning to the corporate world. "Do you want to do it?" "I think I do. But only if you're comfortable with the time commitment and travel it would require." Marcus reached for Elena's hand, squeezing gently. "I think you should absolutely do it. You have knowledge and experience that could help a lot of people, and it sounds like the kind of work that would make you feel like you're making a difference." Elena's smile bloomed across her face, the relief and excitement unmistakable. "I was hoping you'd say that. I miss being involved in policy work, but I wanted to find a way to do it that wouldn't compromise what we've built here." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a desperate man with a broken truck and a frightened son, running from losses he couldn't fix toward an uncertain future. Now he was a husband and father with a home, a purpose, and a partner who chose to share her abundance rather than hoard it. Elena had given up billions of dollars and the power that came with them, but she'd gained something far more valuable, a life that belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own choices rather than inherited obligations. She woke up each morning excited about the day ahead instead of dreading the responsibilities that awaited her. Tyler had gained not just a mother, but a sense of stability and belonging that would serve as the foundation for whatever future he chose to build. He spoke now with the confidence of a child who knew he was completely loved and supported, and his natural curiosity had flourished in an environment where questions were encouraged and exploration was celebrated. "I love you both," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the wonder that still surprised her when she contemplated their unlikely family. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this life was possible. Even when you were dreaming of escaping the corporate world. Even then, I thought the best I could hope for was solitude and maybe some peace. I never dared to dream about love and partnership and feeling like I finally belonged somewhere." Tyler had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted by a day full of cat negotiations and garden exploration and the endless energy of childhood. Marcus gathered his son carefully, marveling at how much heavier Tyler felt now that regular meals and security had allowed him to grow properly. As they carried Tyler inside and tucked him into the bed that would be his for as long as he wanted it, Marcus caught sight of the family photograph on Tyler's nightstand. It showed the three of them on their wedding day, with Cinnamon photobombing. The shot by sitting directly in front of the camera with her tail held high. The image captured everything that mattered about their life together: love, laughter, the willingness to embrace imperfection, and the recognition that the best things in life often came disguised as ordinary moments. Elena had taught them both that wealth meant having enough of what truly mattered, and they discovered together that what mattered most couldn't be bought or inherited. It could only be chosen, nurtured, and shared. Later that night, as Marcus and Elena sat on their bed planning Tyler's birthday celebration and discussing the wetland restoration project, Marcus realized that this was what happiness actually looked like. Not the dramatic highs of major achievements or windfalls, but the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful with people you loved, day by ordinary day. Elena had found her way home not to a place, but to a life that honored who she really was beneath all the expectations and obligations others had placed on her. Marcus had discovered that running away from loss could sometimes lead you exactly where you needed to be. And Tyler had learned that families could be created through choice and commitment just as powerfully as through birth and blood. The ranch would continue to grow and change. Their relationship would face new challenges and celebrate new joys. And Tyler would eventually grow up and create his own adventures. But the foundation they'd built together, based on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to choose love over fear, would endure whatever the future brought. Outside their bedroom window, the barn cats were settling in for the night. The cattle were peaceful in their pastures, and the restored house stood solid and welcoming under the Montana stars. It was a picture of the American dream fulfilled. Not through the accumulation of wealth or status, but through the patient daily work of creating a life worth living. Marcus pulled Elena close, breathing in the scent of her hair and the lingering aroma of garden soil on her hands. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new decisions, and new opportunities to build on what they'd created together. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged: home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.